Hello and welcome to the Technology Risk and Gambling Seminar Series. I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm a professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney and I'm director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic. Before we kick off today, I want to remind anyone that we are ending the season on our favourite episode of the year, which is the opportunity for early career researchers to present. We've already had some presentation proposals, which is fantastic, but please, if you know any early career researchers, if you are an early career researcher, pop on to the Technology Risk and Gambling website, which is on the Brain and Mind Centre website, and there's the details there of how to submit a proposal. We're really excited for the opportunity to be able to showcase some leading researchers from emerging superstars in the field. So today I'm really excited to have someone who I've wanted to have on the TRG webinar for quite a while. I'm very happy to introduce Gohar Yazdabadi, who has a wealth of experience in policy. From a background in the Attorney General's Department, the Australian Government Department of Human Services, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, as well as policy-facing roles within the alcohol and gambling industry. Gohar is now the CEO of COTA New South Wales, which is a representative group for older Australians. Gohar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Sally. It's so great to be here with you, talking about a really important topic and one that's close to my heart.
Oh, thank you. Look, I've given a very brief wraparound of all your experience, which is amazing. This season, we're really focusing on what experts we can teach us from outside of the gambling field. So I've given kind of a very brief overview, but would you mind taking everyone listening through a little bit more detail of how you've ended up having this interest in gambling and how your various roles have provided the right experience for this?
Absolutely. So I started off my career as a lawyer, and that was in the federal government where I spent about 10 years. I started off my big policy piece that got me interested in policy as opposed to the law was the Northern Territory Emergency Response, where I was involved in initiatives like the Basics Card and other general aspects of the Northern Territory, financial aspects of it. I then moved from there into the Attorney General's Department, where I worked on international child abduction cases. And that was a really eye-opening area that was highly charged, but both the policy development and the actual work behind it was very rewarding. From there, I moved into the Strategic Policy Unit at the Attorney General's, and that was an area where I was really able to hone in some of those policy development skills. So it wasn't a unit that looked at either policies that were being developed as a whole across the Attorney Generals, or were looking at policies that needed a little bit of improvement. And we brought in really what we would call cutting edge policy techniques, things like horizon scanning and scenario planning for uncertain futures. And we provided that as a service for the public service generally, as well as internally in Attorney Generals. And then from there, I moved on to working in leading the work on reducing petrol sniffing in remote and regional areas, which was again a really rewarding piece of work. I then was in the public service for 10 years at that point, and I was looking to move back to Sydney. And I guess moving back to Sydney, the federal public service is much smaller and the opportunities there are fewer. So I really started to think about where to from here. And an opportunity came up to work as the Director for Government Relations, Policy and Research in the alcohol peak body, Alcohol Beverages Australia. I was hesitant to start with. It was, I saw myself very much as a career public servant, but I thought I'd take the dive and see how I can use these skills that I've developed in another area. And it was a very rewarding time for me in being able to see and learn how you put together all of those skills that I've learned from the inside and apply them from an external point of view from the government. From there, I moved on to working for the betting industry, and I moved into Sportsbet, where I was the ESG manager and where we first met, Sally. And that was, again, a continuation of the work that I was doing really in the alcohol industry, but moving it over into a slightly more nuanced aspect in the gambling industry. Um, so I guess what really interests me in these areas of alcohol and betting is that you have a very complex policy problem that you're trying to solve, which is delightful for me. And now I thought at this point in my career, I might circle back to more of the NFP space, which I've been involved in throughout my career. And I'm really glad to be here as CEO of Coda Australia, Coda New South Wales.
Wow, and it just goes to show how much you can learn and then apply in different fields. Um, and I won't get into what it's like to work for government versus industry because I feel like that's a whole nother conversation. But it's great that you have retained this interest in gambling because there was a recent report showing that older Australians, which I understand is 50 plus,
Yeah.
50 plus, gambling on average $550 a week, which is an incredible amount considering that this is a group that typically have fixed incomes, often lower incomes and supported by government pensions or other pensions. Although the age of working is increasing, there's also a lot of caring demands on this generation who are looking after, maybe two generations beneath them. Then coupled with the mental health epidemic that we're having, that this generation is certainly far from immune from. In fact, they're probably more likely to be resistant to seeking help because there is that kind of that stoicism, and the stigma around mental health is much more difficult to break in an older generation. So we've got these really conflicting factors. Can you take me through what you know and some of the research you've conducted on to understand what's happening with gambling with older adults in Australia or New South Wales?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we've recently undertaken a survey of older people in New South Wales. We had 2,700 respondents to our research, and our research was primarily focused on loneliness. And for those of you in New South Wales that are tuning in, it might be interesting for you to know that the New South Wales government is undertaking an inquiry into loneliness. So we wanted to understand the full spectrum of what loneliness looks like. And some of our questions related to gambling. So we found that we looked at people who were gambling at least weekly, and we found that in terms of demographics, when we compared them to people who gambled monthly or less, they were more likely to be a carer. So they were up at about the 40% mark of having caring responsibilities compared to 25 to 30% of those who gambled less frequently. They were more likely to be male, and they were more likely to have a First Nations background as well. And then going on to sort of teasing out some of the aspects of loneliness and these more frequent gamblers, we found that 54% of this cohort said that they were lonely. 50% said that they felt isolated. 45% felt that they weren't valued by society. 23% found that they didn't feel that those around them enjoyed being in their company. 35% they felt that they didn't have someone there to support them. And one of the, I think, statistics that really worried me was that 37% of this cohort said that loneliness stopped them from accessing healthcare and seeking help from healthcare professionals and medical practitioners. And I think this is particularly alarming considering that older people often, to start with, find it difficult to access healthcare, and to add loneliness as being something that stops them from doing that exacerbates the problem and makes it more it makes it much more difficult for them to seek the help that they need in these difficult times.
It's really interesting that you've looked into this, and I obviously want to paint the picture. This is clearly a very diverse population. We've got very active, healthy, seniors who are really involved, and then, a whole different spectrum as well. It seems like there's a lot of ageism that's occurring that particularly in Australia, and we might get into the cultural differences, that there is this less not, I don't know if I want to say less respect, but compared to some cultures, I believe. And certainly there seems to be a lot of isolation, which is quite different from other cultures that, people aren't looking after older adults to the same extent as particularly sort of the focus on younger generations. There's so much to sort of unpack here. Can you get into a little bit more around how all this interacts with gambling and the provision of gambling services and products?
Absolutely. So I think what it really supports is that older people are more vulnerable when it comes to gambling and gambling harms. I think that's something that we have to keep front of mind because they're more vulnerable both in terms of the loneliness that they experience and how they experience that loneliness, but also on the flip side, in terms of their attitudes and their approach to gambling harms or seeking help for gambling harms. We know that there's a level of, as you said, stoicism for older people. And that means that when they come across issues, which might be mental health issues, might be loneliness, might be depression, anxiety, and then gambling related harms as well, they see this often as being simply a part of aging, that this is what naturally happens. So these feelings that I have of anxiety or loneliness, and I act on them by going and partaking in gambling, it's not seen as for them as being an issue. They can't see it as being an issue because they think this is a natural aspect of aging. And because they're isolated, the cohort that we're speaking about, because they're often isolated, they often don't see others around them who are of the same age but might be doing very different activities, or they might feel that they don't belong in those sorts of activities, that they're not valued enough, they're feeling depressed as it is, and they're unable to join in those activities to be able to move away from gambling or seek help that they need in relation to gambling.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So I think that amongst the different products, there are some sort of the younger age of older adults, potentially online wagering. We know that particularly men, sort of 50 to 65, are a very strong target audience for wagering providers, particularly if they have access to funds or even if they don't have access to funds. But we do see this also typical generation of women being more likely to play gaming machines and quite into the elder years. And a lot of venues are really set up to cater to people who are older, who have time during the day, who want to attend the bingo or have the cheap coffee and the cake. The venues are really catered, and it's often something that's sort of said as a really positive. We're part of our community. We're bringing people together. We've got, buses out there. When people are feeling lonely and isolated, they might sort of go online for betting, or they might, is it a positive thing that these sort of community venues? I can't think of many venues in the community, maybe a library or community centre, but other than a club is something that is always available. It's safe, it's air conditioned, there's transport, it's got food and beverage. This seems like a really uniquely welcoming environment for older adults.
Absolutely. And it goes even further than that, I would say, Sally. When you're part of a club, you've got your membership card. You're part of something. You belong to something. It's somewhere where you're always welcome. There's someone standing at the door. Often they'll know your name. They'll welcome you. They'll ask about you, what you did today, what you did yesterday. There's someone there to have a chat with you. And, you know, it's it's the equivalent of going on a holiday to a five-star resort, really. And that's something that's out of the reach of a lot of these people. So when you have a venue set up that ticks off so many of your needs, it really is difficult to then not become a part of that sort of situation. It's very appealing. We have to think about it. When when we talk about our different aspects of our lives and different stages of our lives, so let's, for example, you're thinking about your career. We put a lot of time and effort into thinking about our careers. People get career coaches to come in and help them. People plan out, 5, 10 years of what their career is going to look like. And then you suddenly come into this period of retirement. And often people haven't thought about what that period of their time is realistically going to look like for them. So they don't often have goals that they've set to reach. They haven't set a path of activities and things to keep them going and goals for the next 5 to 10 years. So they find themselves in this situation where venues provide everything they need in the one place, and they can keep going time and time again without having to plan it out, without having to think much about it. And really, it's somewhere where everyone knows your name.
Yeah, well, so I mean, is that a positive thing? I guess is one of the questions. It seems like there are some benefits of this. I know my mother-in-law spends hours at her local gym because she is chatting with people, and it's not in a gambling venue, but I know some gyms are based in gambling venues. So it's really good to have a place where people can go and feel welcome, and that also if they don't have someone specifically, because I know in a venue you can kind of sit by yourself but still feel somewhat social. So is this overall a benefit for the communities?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I guess the way that I would look at it is that it can be a benefit. It definitely can be a benefit, but there needs to be something there um, to do. And I'm not saying that, having that coffee and sitting there isn't something to do, but there needs to be a greater variety of things for people to interact with while they're there, other than gambling, to spend those periods of time. We're talking about people going in there not to just spend a half an hour having a cake and coffee. We're talking about hours. People will spend hours in these venues. And if you go there during the middle of the day, as you said, there might be a little bit of bingo, a little bit of keno or something like that, but there isn't really any true activities that extend beyond gambling, really. And to be able to say that it's truly diverse and caters for a variety of things and is entertainment focused, or we need to see a much greater variety of activities happening.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's similar to the after hours economy where we've seen discussions around or skate parks. We're telling young people not don't hang out at shopping centres, but what can they do? Well, let's build a skate park, or shift workers, let's open the library at later hours of night. So it seems like it's part of a more systemic change that either gambling venues need to be able to or incentivized to open, make further amenities available, or there needs to be, businesses or governments providing alternative groups. And some community centres certainly do this. I've seen this in my community, but I'm sure it varies a lot. Do you see any differences? Maybe, I don't know if your research, you probably haven't looked into this, but obviously there's going to be differences presumably based on, more metropolitan versus regional and rural locations. Are there any metropolitans based on sort of the level of financial well-being of the individuals or the community in which they live?
So we don't have that data. Our data isn't rich enough to be able to really deep dive into that sort of level. But what I would say is that overall, in terms of the differences that we see, is that we have to, I think we have to accept that a club in a regional or rural area is really the heart, or it can be the heart of that area, of that geographic location, and it can provide some really important services. So, when we see people who have there's a major weather event, for example, they serve as really important areas for people to go into and be able to have shelter, to disseminate information, all of those sorts of things. Um, but I think it's an area that needs a lot more research in terms of whether gambling habits or trends change between the two uh, demographics.
Mm. So In terms of your policy work, what do you think is the action here? Is this something where there needs to be different policies on? There's been conversations in New South Wales about cashless gambling. Tasmania has introducing a cap on spend, and I've seen this applied successfully in other jurisdictions as well. What are the steps that do you think from a policy point of view need to be taken at this point?
Sure. I think there's two aspects of policy that need to be looked at. Firstly is that direct policy response to gambling itself that you just mentioned. So definitely we are waiting to see the results of the New South Wales cashless trials, and we're very eager. We think that they will provide a very strong precedent for that kind of policy to be implemented, and we would like to see that policy implemented. Caps are definitely something that we'd like to see as well. When we're talking about $550 that you mentioned previously, a month for older people, when we put that into perspective of a pension's fixed income of someone on a pension who still needs to often pay some kind of housing costs, they still have to pay for their food, medication, healthcare. You really don't have $550 left over at the end of the month to be able to spend on gambling. So those caps are absolutely something that we would like to see brought in. And I think those statistics are very clear that they do need to be brought in. But I think there's a second part of the policy landscape that needs to be looked at, and that's the government's policy when it comes to prevention. And what we would like to see is much greater funding for older people, especially these cohorts who are lonely, to make sure that they are able to get all of those things that we talked about before. So transport, a venue with air conditioning that they can go in, someone that they can talk to, someone that knows their name, somewhere where they can, sit down and have an affordable meal. We want to see that continue, and we'd like to see the government support that through funding for programs and funding for initiatives to allow community organisations to be able to run those sorts of venues, but with the added bonus of more of the greater variety of activities for them to be able to partake in, or as you said, not partake in, sit down, enjoy the atmosphere, maybe enjoy their solitude, but still feel as though that they're part of something. But we can't do that without funding. And that's, I think, a key lever in all of this as well, that the government's policy has to look beyond simply mechanisms, blunt mechanisms, but necessary mechanisms, but also look to the greater policy field and make sure that organisations like COTA can do their job.
Yeah, it's so important because there's also a lack of evidence of this because it's not measured very well. But the more someone gambles to a detrimental point of view, particularly an older adult, is likely to then have costs on the welfare system, on the medical system, on the next generation that have to support their potential aging parents. The trickle down costs of gambling in a problematic way, or even gambling right at the limits, where it's potentially not causing a severe problem, but it's reducing the ability to spend and live comfortably. It has huge costs. So while the government is taking taxation and the revenue is going to the venues, there are huge costs being, trickled down through generations. And the other aspect is we know that gambling and gambling in a problematic way is hugely influenced by generational generational sort of interchange. So we see this influence effect. And when young people grow up seeing their grandparents, go to a venue or bet online or whatever it's they're doing, that's extremely influential on the behavior that individual as a younger generation is likely to go up in. So, do we think we need different strategies? The government certainly do have, gambling harm prevention. There's offices and campaigns, and there's a real focus on young people because, online and gaming, and that certainly is a vulnerable group. But I haven't seen any particular campaigns, and you might be more aware than I am, when I was in Canada, the Responsible Gaming Council did have specific campaigns for older adults that was encouraging them to just engage in different activities, and that was part of their anti-gambling campaigns. Do you think we need a specific strategy for older adults in terms of whether it's public awareness or interventions?
Absolutely, I think we do, because I think that there's unique problems that are being faced by older people. We have to, I think, front of mind of what I would like policy decision makers to be thinking about, and the wider community, is that when you're looking at older people, you have to understand that life can be very different for them from where they started and where we are at the moment. They've often gone through some kind of, and this actually came out really strongly in our research. Uh, eh, People who gambled frequently told their stories to us through the survey, and a lot of them, the story that they told was that they've gone through some kind of grief, for example. So they've lost a loved one, or somebody that they were very close to has had to move to a nursing home or move out of state to be closer. They've lost a network of friends because they've had to move because they can't afford to live in the metropolitan area anymore. And they've then fallen into this falling into this loneliness or this isolation that they weren't expecting to fall into. So when we understand that they're coming from from that kind of a situation often, and then when we then think about the ways that they like to communicate, it's very different to the younger generation. Then often, for example, in everything that we do, we provide telephone numbers, we provide face-to-face contact when we can, we do all of those sorts of things. And that's really important because older people need to be able to see themselves in what's going on and in campaigns. Because if they don't see themselves and they don't see what they're experiencing in these campaigns, it's unlikely to resonate with them, and it's unlikely for them to be able to take a stance. And I think this comes to the point of underlying ageism as well. So when these campaigns are created, older people might not be front of mind when they're being created. So they then become invisible in these campaigns. And then when you're invisible in a campaign, you're less likely to be able to identify with it. And the less likely you are to be able to identify with it means the less likely you are to be able to take action. And also the less likely you are to be able to see the problem within yourself at that as well. The other thing that I would, I think is really important to remember is that older people have a wealth of experience and knowledge, and they come from a very diverse background as well. So in any campaigns that are run specifically for them, we've got to remember that we've got to talk directly to that audience, and it needs to be positive, and it needs to draw on a narrative of understanding that this doesn't come from a place of ignorance, but it just comes from a place where you might need a little bit of extra help.
Yeah, I think that they're really important points to think about communicating. And we do know, obviously, that you can't have a universal message. We do have to target specific groups. And it does unfortunately come down to when there's a limited funding and you have a strategic priority on young people, which is important, but we don't want to ignore the older generation. You mentioned cashless gambling, and that's obviously a mechanism through which people can link their bank accounts directly to gamble, but which isn't necessarily a good thing, but the positives of it are that you have to have an account, you have to log in, you can be able to set a limit, you have activity statements, and there's friction points introduced. So it's a way to help people manage their gambling. It doesn't have to have limits, but it could have limits in place. However, this does require a level of technological literacy. So to be able to, you have to, of course, have a smartphone, you have to be able to download an app, you have to be able to prove your identity online, you have to link you have to have an online banking account, use it, be able to link it. Not again to be ageist and suggest that older people are unable to do this, but do you think there is any particular concerns around older people engaging with campaigns that do require a great deal of technological literacy?
I think that you've really hit a problem that's very, very real. And this kind of bringing in uh, cashless gambling and the steps that you need to take in order to be able to do that. I I, I think that for part of the population, it would pose an issue, but I don't think it'd be an insurmountable issue. I think we've seen great strides for people when it comes to technology. We saw it around COVID with QR codes and their ability to adapt and be able to engage in that way. But we also have to remember that where there is that difficulty for them, we do need to be able to provide solutions for that and help them through that process as well.
Yeah, and I think that's completely a good example of, QR codes, and also goes to the role of venues. If they are going to be putting themselves forward as a supportive, welcoming environment, there's having staff members there to assist people, to assist people in using the technology. And the role, again, not being ageist about presuming older people can't engage with these, but how we might just need to buffer and scaffold in different ways.
Absolutely.
So there's definitely around interventions. From a treatment perspective, we see historically are people coming in for gambling treatment are likely to be older adults, traditionally with race betting and gaming machines. We're now seeing an increase in younger people coming with sports betting, which never really occurred before. We know that people tend to seek treatment for gambling problems often 9 to 10 years after they occur. So there is a lag, meaning that it is more likely it's an older generation seeking help, whether or not the problems emerged at a younger or an older age. But during this time, people are, visiting their GP, potentially seeking advice from other health providers or mental health providers. They might be engaging with financial counselors, with their banks, with lawyers, and various government organizations. What do you think is the role of, enhancing screening and professionals asking about gambling in various ways to different generations? Do you think that's something that should be done more often with older adults?
Absolutely, it needs to be done more often with the older adults. I think the question more is how it's done, whether or not, other than should it be done or shouldn't it be done. With older adults, I think we need to think about sort of the atmosphere that they are in at the time, and it can often be that they are losing their or they feel that they're losing their autonomy sometimes. They feel that they might be losing their influence sometimes. They have children who are growing up who may be more involved in their decision making than previously. So they can often feel a sense of being judged. They can often feel a sense of loss of confidence, loss of autonomy, and they may suddenly have what they feel as being, too many people involved in their personal business. So when we talk about these sorts of initiatives where professionals are engaging with older people, they may have already heard things from their family. They may have already heard things from their friends about their gambling problem, and they may be defensive about it to start with. So it's really important from our perspective that it's an issue that's treated with delicacy and with the lens of understanding that there needs to be no judgment involved in what's in the advice that's given. So we'd like to see not just the sort of screening for gambling, but on top of that, we'd also like to see better training around how to interact with your client when they're an older person and what sort of systems or approaches may work best for them to get the best outcomes for them.
That's such a good point, because I think It makes me think also to affordability checks, and that's something that's been discussed with online wagering in particularly. It's been introduced in the UK, and there is a sort of duty of care of venues as well, checking in, asking with their customers, "Are you okay?" And if there are risks detected, asking more pointed questions around, "Is this affordable for you?" But in the mix of the fact that there is still this kind of respect in the sense of, what's appropriate to ask and not being sure potentially how an older person will react, not wanting to push. So someone says, "Yes, I'm fine." Okay, well, I asked and they said they're fine. I don't want to push. I don't want to be nosy. It's disrespectful. Talking about money, particularly in an older generation, is a bit of a stigma privacy issue. So people tend to, even if they do have good intentions, have a difficulty getting through that, whereas with the younger generation, they might be more comfortable having that. When it's someone older than you, it's more difficult to have that conversation. And I unfortunately have been seen instances where older people with all the best intentions are regular venue patrons, and they go in and they smile and they chat, and then it turns out many, at some point in time, that there was all this harm going on behind the scenes, and there were really just devastating consequences. But the venue thought they were doing the right thing. They did check in. So I think that idea of training is really critical, of how to have practical skills to be able to probe in a respectful but in an effective way around, as you say, gambling, but also these issues of loneliness and support, because we're just starting to learn how impactful social support is for physical and mental health.
Absolutely. No, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, Sally. We we don't we want to make sure that everybody understands the 50 plus cohort as well as possible. And having said that, within the 50 plus cohort, that's a large cohort as well of different experiences and different approaches. But there are some universal things that I think are important. And I think more training is definitely the key in helping ensure that they get the support that they need in the best possible way.
Yeah, and we've been talking about people, older adults as people who gamble, but I want to also switch to the idea of older adults being impacted by someone else's gambling, particularly as we know that financial abuse is increasing, that digital banking systems and digital, finance systems unfortunately do make older people potentially more vulnerable. We know online scams, whether they're romance or, clicking on the links, it's really out of control. And obviously less technologically literate people are going to be more likely to fall victims. And the numbers are staggering in terms of the amount of scams happening, and presumably that's the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of people don't report the scams. You know there have been many instances of older people being impacted in terms of, for example, a younger person remortgaging their house, or rating like something, financial crime against older adults. What are your thoughts on the financial vulnerability of older people and their response, how they're being impacted by other people's gambling?
Absolutely. There is definitely a significant impact there, and it can be devastating. So for older people, they've when it comes to the financial aspect of things, they've worked their whole lives, they've saved, they've gotten to wherever they are financially. Recovering that financially for them is very difficult. They can't just go out and work. They can't just go out and get more money. It's not a possibility. And it's often at a time where they need those finances for their own well-being, their own health. They, may be going into nursing home facilities or such things, and those funds are absolutely critical for them. So this isn't, and I say that because it's important to understand the lens that we're looking at when they become vulnerable to these sorts of situations. So $100,000 for them is not just $100,000 that they can go and re-earn. That's it. That's gone. That's not coming back for them, and it's something that they needed. But we are seeing this more and more, and we are really concerned about it. We see things like I'll set up your mobile phone and your mobile accounting for you. Give me the phone and I'll do it all for you. Let's call them and get your password reset. And, you can trust me. I'll hold on to the phone for you. Somebody else holds on to all of your passwords. You trust them. They're your relative, they're your good friend. They've been there with you for a long time. They're your child. And unfortunately, it can go south very fast. And the consequences of that are extraordinarily huge. Just as you said, remortgaging of primary residence for somebody at that age can be the difference between them being able to get a spot in a nursing home facility or not being able to do that. It's a devastating consequence, and it's all too frequent.
And we are seeing, an increase in homelessness amongst older adults and older women in particular. So obviously it's not all drawn to gambling, but there are real concerns around this. And that's when that spend amongst people on a fixed income is really concerning because it is fixed and very realistically so. So it's difficult to know what the right policy is. And this is why I've always struggled with caps, because I can't conceive of a cap that is sufficiently low to allow it to be appropriately protective for someone on a fixed income that's actually also high enough for someone engaging in recreational gambling that has a large amount of money. So I think that's one of the real issues with having a fixed cap, is it still likely will be too high for the most vulnerable groups in society. So what can we do as we're sort of thinking about ways to definitely put in policies to make the product safer, the environment safer? Should there be any further requirements, or do we need more education for older people? Where would you think the best use of resourcing be to start to tackle some of these issues?
Sure. So I think there's a few things there. And I think that the first one is, while the balance is hard to get for a cap, it's still something that is, I still think it's not impossible. And I still think that there is an onus on policy decision makers to really be able to sit down and nut that out and come up with something sensible with the input of, everybody from wider society. Even if it's not a fixed cap, and even if there has to be effort put in behind that to come up with the right cap for each person, then so be it. If that's sort of the situation that we need, if there needs to be actual financial assessments done to be able to come up with that non-universal cap. We do it when you go and get a credit card. Somebody assesses you. When you go and get a bank loan, somebody assesses you and makes sure that you have and has an onus to make sure that you are able to function with that product, and that product is not going to put you in a situation of harm. So we know it's possible. And that's something that I would encourage to look at. But I really think that in this policy situation, we do also need to, as I said previously, look outward as well and see how we can support not just older people, but younger people as well in whatever it is that we can offer to move away and create an environment outside of gambling that is enjoyable, that gives people all of those things that they seek out from gambling in another environment.
Do you think this is the role for sort of local councils and communities? Because it feels like something that does need to be really bespoke to the environment, and the available resources of the individuals and the groups where they are.
Absolutely. I think it's the more local it is, the better. So I think for every cohort, grassroots organizations know their cohort really well and do really good work on a very small budget. So investing in them, having more programs out there, having more access to facilities is crucial to be able to do that. I think local governments play a really important role. Again, they know their constituents well. They know what's happening in every little nook and corner of their local areas. So no one is better placed than grassroots organisations and local councils to be able to give bespoke and tailored activities and programs to be able to help.
Yeah, and it also goes to a resourcing issue where older people are highly capable of providing a lot of services and needs and filling gaps in terms of whether it's volunteering or paid roles or a mixture between, making these sort of fill so many different gaps in the system by engaging and actively working with older adults. And it also, I guess, in addition to the local community councils, it also puts potentially an onus on the venues, particularly the clubs who are claiming to be, the heart of their neighbourhood. And in some case, if that is indeed true, then it puts an additional onus on them to be more socially responsible and reduce, the focus on gaming as an entertainment and focus more on facilitating these sorts of connections and awareness, hosting the groups or the learn another language or whatever it is, that there is a venue, there's plenty of money there that's supposed to be reinvested back into the environment. So it does put a real onus on the clubs to start stepping up.
Absolutely. So my local club is Leichhardt Bowls Club, and they don't have gaming machines there at all. And it is an amazing environment to walk into. So we have our local preschool has their annual event there. There's a playground in the back. There's still the lawn bowls there for people to partake in. There's somebody who knows your name as you walk in, which, as I say, is really important. So all of these things, and they understand the local community and they cater to the needs of the local community really well. It's a really inviting environment. So all of these things are really very possible and don't take much to pivot from one way to another, really.
Yeah, and there are organisations like COTA, and I presume there's other organisations in other jurisdictions as well that can support these efforts. And there's a lot of people around if tapped into and trained. And as you say, shoestring budgets can get a really lot out if the resourcing and the implementation and setup is done appropriately.
Absolutely. Again, that's exactly what it is. It's about resourcing well, and letting us get on and do our jobs in these sorts of areas is critical.
Yeah, look, we're coming towards the end of the webinar, but I want to recap because I feel like we've covered so much ground. Some of the really interesting points you've made. I really particularly like that idea of training professionals of how to respectfully and effectively communicate with older adults. And I think that's something that should be part of training for health and welfare, mental health professionals, but also for gambling venue staff, particularly those in venues and operators online that do have older adults, which we know are gambling, to have specific communication skills on what are the issues for these populations. And I'm not sure that's in gambling venue staff training, but I think that's a really useful way to be able to probe and assess for potential harms and provide support, because it's not just about gambling harms, it's about other issues and support that an individual could benefit from that is going to make such a huge impact to that individual with just a few simple words from an appropriately placed individual in their lives. I think that's a really critical aspect I haven't actually heard that before, so that's why I really wanted to circle back to that one.
Yeah, I think it is critical, Sally. It's I think again, it comes back to ageism. It comes back to not treating everyone in exactly the same way, but making sure that older people are seen and heard, and that includes the way that you approach them in any sort of setting.
And you've done this survey, which I presume is going to be published and available on loneliness. What are some of the action points that you think? I'm sure this is something that is really relevant to people in lots of different areas and jurisdictions. Loneliness, as it relates to gambling, but also more broadly than that, because there's such interwoven issues. What are some of the action points or strategies you have going forward?
Absolutely. So there's a few sort of key things that we think are really important, and one of them is around bereavement, loss. So we'll be advocating really strongly for appropriate supports for people who are older and are going through loss and grief. There's not enough, I would say, really bespoke programs for older people, and it's something that's really close to them. So what I think often happens is that we say, well, as you grow older, loss is something that's going to happen. It is natural, it is inevitable, and therefore you should just be able to sort of cope with it and move along from there. But that's not how it feels to someone who is going through it. It is really quite traumatic to be losing a partner of 30, 40 years. So we think that the first sort of step is really good access to trauma and grief counselling for older people that's affordable and that's accessible and that's appropriate for their age. The other thing that we'd like to see is a greater variety of activities and programs available for older people. So what our survey results sort of felt is that people didn't want to go into the activities that were or social things that were available to them because they felt that, and I think the question was worded, I don't partake in these activities because people think I'm old and activities for older people are boring and I don't want to go to them basically. And that resonated really strongly with our audience is that they're sort of being boxed into community gardens or things like that that they think are going to be what older people want, and they might not be. So the other thing that we want to see is, local governments, the state government, whoever is putting together programs for older people, is to first stop and listen and see what's actually needed as opposed to presuming what is needed. To be able to get people up and active and in their local communities and sort of moving away from loneliness. And I guess the third one is what I do come back to time and time again, which is funding, funding, funding. It's so important for us.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, the reason I wanted to get into these issues around loneliness is if we can address some of these root underlying causes, not only will this reduce vulnerability for gambling harms, but it also turns this generation into such a crucial support generation for, we know the cost of living and housing and the stress that, younger adults and middle-aged adults that everyone's under. So the more resources and more resilient we can make older generations, that trickle-down effect is going to be so strong, not only in terms of preventing gambling harm for the individuals, but also making them more resilient to assist and support those in the younger generations and provide a really positive role model. And we know that that is just the most crucial thing in society. So I feel like we could go on and on about this. It's such an important issue, and I'm really pleased to have been able to have you share it, because I think it's something, particularly in the gambling field, I don't hear discussed really, really at all. Before we close off, I wanted to turn over to you, Gohar, and see if there's any other sort of closing points you'd like to mention.
Absolutely. So I think there's just one thing that I'd like to mention, and that's around efforts for policy change and how to make those efforts a reality is something that I'm really passionate about. It's something that my career's kind of culminated towards. And there's something that I'd like to call on anybody watching this to do is, if you're trying to get change in the in the betting industry and in the gambling industry, I think it's really important to remember that industry is a part of this as well. And if you engage well with industry and if you engage sensibly with industry, there is a huge power there for you to unlock. And you might find, surprisingly, an ally to be able to help you in getting those changes that you need. So I would urge everyone not to discount industry altogether in your efforts, because they are a key player in getting the changes that you're looking for as well. And also in relation to sort of policy change, I think the other sort of key thing that I think is important is that in everything that we're doing across the board in civil society, I think when we're calling for policy change, it's important that we're seen as the voice of reason and that it's easy for policy decision makers to listen to us and to make changes based on what we're saying.
Oh,
So they're
really?
just my ending remarks for policy
No,
change.
perfect. And you've got such a breadth of experience, so we'd be a fool not to draw on that. And certainly, I agree that involving stakeholders, but the consumers, the end users, as well as the various, industry and government at all its different layers, but particularly the community as well. And we know that at the end of the day, politics is involved in policy, so that the community voice is going to be what is really influential. Gohar, thank you so much for sharing your time. I know how busy you are, and thank you for the amazing work that you're doing. It's been a pleasure having you on the TRG webinar series.
Thanks so much, Sally.
And thank you to everyone for listening in, whether live or after the fact. If you want to be in contact with Gohar, is LinkedIn or Quota potentially the best sites to go to?
Absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn.
And that report will be available as soon as possible, I have no doubt. And we look forward to potentially future investigations into gambling in a more detailed way. So thank you, everyone. Don't forget to remind any early careers such as about the upcoming end of season finale. And look forward to speaking to everybody next week, where I will be speaking with Judith Glynn, who is again another policy expert who will be drawing on her expertise in international jurisdictions to look at who is doing what when it comes to positive policy to reduce gambling related harms. Until then, thank you all very much.